The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction. I want to start with some brief bios of a few people who hopefully represent something of the wider population of folk in Singapore. Chung is married with 2 children, an older boy and a younger girl. He always had a strong sense of responsibility to family, including his aging parents, and also to an unmarried sister. At university, he studied IT in an area where there were plentiful jobs on the horizon, which were well paid and had some good prospects of advancement. He works hard at his job. He puts in extra hours when asked, but he prefers, when possible, to spend as much time as he can with his family, both his nuclear family and also his wider extended family. He doesn't find his work particularly stretching. It's all fairly straightforward so far, but he's glad to have a secure job with reasonable colleagues and with the occasional opportunity for some kind of promotion. Maya is a young woman in her early 20s with a temporary work permit from a neighbouring country. She tried hard in her own country to find a decent job, but found it difficult to turn up anything that covered more than basic living expenses. Living away from the family is hard. Placing in the background for the time being the possibility of getting married was not an easy decision. But she found work as a domestic servant and is primarily responsible for cleaning and cooking, for looking after the children, after school in particular, and caring for the dog. Sometimes she feels a bit of a second-class person, but she also at times feels somewhat under pressure to do more than she should. However, she earns a better wage than she could in her own country, and she's able to send some of that money back to support her family. She's pleased to have the work. Chow Hui is a single woman. She's a little older, early 30s. At school, a teacher stimulated her interest in science. Although the kind of work she was interested in was mostly a male preserve, she decided to put effort into it and to try and make it work for her. The practical outcome of the work that she's doing is not particularly clear to her, but she enjoys the kind of work that she's given, the methods it employs, the challenges it offers. It's stimulating work. She's convinced that women can play as much a role in this kind of work as any other person, and she's, although open to marriage if it comes her way, not sure that she would want to accept it if it would require her to choose between that and her career. Jen Guo comes from a well-to-do family with a strong sense of responsibility to others. Her parents were both very involved and still are very involved in improving circumstances for people who are in need, who are less fortunate than they were when they were growing up. When he graduated, he found himself drawn to types of work that offered opportunity to assist those who were also in some need in society at large. people who suffered some disadvantage perhaps. He believed that this kind of work was remunerated enough to live a reasonable life, and that there were some prospects to advance in it into more responsible positions. He's hoping to find a partner who would share his concerns and perhaps join him in actually working together. Wei and Ling are a younger married couple expecting their first child. He had begun working as a doctor, she as an educator. Though they enjoyed what they were doing and felt it was making a difference in the lives of the people that they were with, through their involvement in a local church, they were challenged to consider missionary work in an adjoining country, one in a hospital and one in a school nearby. In accepting this, they were given the honour of becoming full-time workers for God, who felt that they could serve him better than they could in their local church around the edges of their other work. They only made this decision after discussing at length with key people whom they knew, family, friends, others in the church, and they have now begun taking up this work overseas and are enjoying it greatly, despite some real challenges. This group of 5 people don't represent by any means all the work situations that people find themselves here in Singapore, but they do represent a reasonable range of possibilities. In their own way, they embody 5 different approaches to work, or attitudes to work. For some, work is basically having a good job and doing it well. For others, work is much more a personal career which they feel quite passionately about and want to pursue with as much vigour as they can. For others, their work is primarily a way of making a significant contribution to a range of other people who will be advantaged by it and might otherwise not be. For some, it's basically obeying a divine call to a special field of work, perhaps in a special place or another place beyond their own home country. For some, it's basically about earning a decent wage and doing something that's also worthwhile for some people. I'll come back to these people towards the end of my talk, but I want first to step back from their particular concrete situations and have us spend a little time revisiting a biblical perspective on work, particularly daily work, the ordinary kind of work, as we say, that most of us are engaged in. And to look at that from God's point of view. This will help us not only look at these stories that I've told through a particular lens and try and gauge where and how it fits in to what God is mostly interested in by way of work, but will also give us an angle, a view on some fairly representative Christian attitudes to work in general. I just mentioned a few of these which are quite common in Christian circles, whether in churches, parachurches, sermons, books that we read on the subject, etc. Many Christians have a strong leaning towards the helping professions, as we call them, because they feel they provide a specially helpful context for serving God. Though they would not grace what they do by saying that it is a form of ministry as such. Others would say that God's main concern is that whatever work we do, mostly as employees of somebody else, that we work hard, that we are honest in our dealings, that we are fair in our relationships, that we are obedient to our employers, and that we look for opportunities to share our faith when they come our way. Others would say that a prime reason for work is to financially support Christians in full-time service in the church, on the mission field, or in Christian organisations. Some would say that working for churches, missionary societies and Christian institutions is more pleasing to God, closer to God's heart, than working in other kinds of occupations. Some would say that unlike the work of evangelism and preaching, ordinary work doesn't have any eternal significance, just temporal value in this world, at its best anyway. To the Bible then. The Bible literally makes reference to hundreds of kinds of occupations. If you look in a good library, perhaps down at Trinity Theological College, you should find a book some 30 or 40 years old now called All the Trades and Occupations of the Bible. And it just lists, one after another, page after page, every single type of trade or occupation that's mentioned somewhere in the Bible. There are lots of people also mentioned in connection with work, but we don't know exactly what their work was, and those people are listed as well. This is quite a long book. It runs into, I forget now, 80 or 90 or 100 pages with columns, 2 per page, which indicates something of the range of occupations that the Bible mentions on the way through. And of course, reference to work appears very early. As you remember, Adam and Eve are responsible in the first 2 or 3 chapters for looking after the garden in which God has placed them. They are gardeners. Genesis 2:15 to 16. And the work that they do is called not just good, but very good. Genesis 1:31. It's only after they break a prohibition that God places before them that their work begins to involve painful toil and is done by the sweat of the brow, as we find in Genesis 3:16 to 18. You know these passages well. In the next few chapters of the Bible, we get reference to the work of farmers, shepherds, musicians, toolmakers, boat builders. That's Noah. As we go on further through the Old Testament, there are lengthy sections devoted not just to priests or to prophets or to religious leaders, but to significant figures in what we would regard as these days secular occupations. People like Joseph, a prime minister, master builders like Bezalel and Ahoolab, an immigrant labourer, Ruth, an army commander, Joab, senior bureaucrats, David and his friends, a governor, Nehemiah, a young queen, consort, Esther, and many, many others. As we move into the New Testament, we meet people who are in the role of being a personal secretary or scribe, Mark, medical doctor, Luke, skilled tradespeople, Aquila and Priscilla, a businesswoman with her own business, Lydia, an ethnic leader, Jason, and a garment maker, Dorcas, just to name a few. It's important to note, however, that even those who in Old Testament or New Testament are talked about as primarily religious leaders, that would be our general term for them, mostly are also partly doing, some of the time, and often a lot of the time, ordinary kinds of work. Moses, for example, was actively involved in developing the nation's legal, social, and civic life, not just in being a formative and model religious leader of Israel. It's similar with David. He's involved in foreign affairs and military involvements of various kinds as a general. He's also the prime musician in the country. He's their celebrity artist, you might say. Some of the prophets only did that kind of work for a limited period of time. Amos is a good example, who only spent 3 years as a prophet and the rest of his life as a farmer. The wise men mentioned in Proverbs and elsewhere mostly provided counsel to people and situations of a very everyday family, community and social obligatory kind. Many of Jesus' disciples didn't leave their jobs. Some did for a period of time, but not all did, to travel with him. But others continued their work in their everyday positions. His most famous apostle, Paul, was a tent maker some of the time in various cities in which he lived, not just preaching, evangelizing, and teaching. Tent making was a regular part of his domestic work. We think these days of tent makers, as we call them in inverted commas, as a kind of second-class kind of ministry in a way, or a second type of ministry, only partly involved in full-time ministry or missionary work. Paul was one of those, and yet he was the greatest achiever, you might say, in the missionary area right down through the last 20th centuries. It's important to note also that many of these people that I've mentioned weren't called to their work in any direct or dramatic way as some of the prophets and others were by God. A few, yes, mostly not. Not the people I've mentioned in the last 5 to 10 minutes. Mostly God drew them into his work or led them into his work in a wide variety of ways. Sometimes connected with the kind of people that they were, their personality, or the particular concerns or interests that they had, or the particular kind of work or the methods employed in that work that he was drawing them into. God's very versatile about the way in which he does this. There is no one way in which in the Old or New Testament people end up doing the thing that God wants them to do. I could go into great detail about that if we had time, because there are just so many examples of it. If you pick up the little booklet on daily work as divine vocation, you'll find a lot of examples of that. It's also clear that the Bible doesn't support the view that there are two classes of believers: those who have experienced a dramatic call to some kind of full-time service, and those who learn by degrees what the work that God wants them to do actually is and get on and fulfill it. There are some clear markers that support this. For example, when Paul talks about the work that most of his converts are doing, he uses the same word as those who have experienced some direct and dramatic call to a specific vocation. He does not use different words. And the primary word that he uses is the word serve or service or servant, which is exactly the same in its meaning as the word minister or ministry. These two words come from the same word in the original language. They mean exactly the same thing, not something different. Paul also, in a similar way, describes everything believers do, if they do it rightly, whether it's in the world during the week or in the church when they get together on a weekend, as worship of God. Romans 12, 1-2. And the implication of this is that no kind of work is more reverent than any other kind of work, or that only certain kinds of work are full-time Christian service and others not. From God's point of view, all are equally ministries and all are equally involving people's full concentration, and therefore all are equally pleasing to him. The Reformers made this wonderfully and challengingly clear. I pick the earliest of them in England, William Tyndale. Moreover, put no difference between works, but whatsoever comes into thy hands, do that, as time, place, and occasion gives, and as God hath put thee in degree, high or low. For as touching to please God, there is no work better than another. God looks not first on thy work as the world does, as though the beauty of the work pleased him as it does the world, or as though he had need of them. But God looks first on thy heart, what faith you have to his words, how you believe in him, trust him, and how thou love him and his mercy for all that he has showed you. If you compare deed and deed, there is a difference between washing dishes and preaching the word of God. But as touching God, pleasing God, there is no difference at all. Let everyone, of whatsoever craft or occupation, whether brewer, baker, tailor, winemaker, merchant, farmer, refer to his craft and occupation to the commonwealth, and serve his brethren as he would do Christ himself. There are many passages, and I'll quote one in a slightly different connection shortly, saying exactly the same thing, as eloquently, if not more eloquently, in Luther and Calvin. But before heading there, I want to draw back a little bit from that and just ask about what is the connection, the precise connection between our work, such as Tyndale talks about here, and God's work. It's interesting, of course, that the very first way God is referred to in the Bible is not as Father, not as Lord, but as Creator, as a worker. That's the first thing we learn about God from reading Genesis. He made the world, everything and everyone in it. We tend to think that the work of God is different to ours, quite different to ours mostly. But since, as we are told in Genesis 1:26, we are made in his image, there must be some connection between God's work and ours work. And the first chapter in the Bible confirms this. Again, it uses a particular word. It's a Hebrew word this time. No need to tell you what it is. But that same word is used both of God's work and human work. Not different words for the two of them. As the Christian apologist and novelist Dorothy Sayers says in her book, The Mind of the Maker, a main characteristic shared by God and we humans is the desire and the ability to make things. When we turn away from particular words used to describe God's work and our work to images of God at work, it becomes even more transparent that there is a connection between his work and ours. God is described in various books of the Bible as builder, architect, farmer, winemaker, fruit grower, gardener, weaver, clothes designer, potter, metal worker, composer, performer. There are others that could be included which are more familiar: teacher, counselor, advocate, warrior, guide, healer, nurse, writer, and poet. It's quite a range, and there are many others that could be also mentioned. Looking at this range of pictures or descriptions of God at work, it soon becomes clear that they're used because there is some kind of similarity or connection between the kind of work all these people do as human beings and the kind of work that God is doing, whatever differences there might also be. theologians have mostly stepped back from the images and tried to focus on particular words which gather up a number of what these images say into terms which cover a certain range of God's activities, because God is involved in all sorts of things. Certainly God is our Redeemer. That's the thing that we think about and should think about first and foremost. But God, as already mentioned, is Creator, our Creator. God is our provider. There are so many passages that you could create a whole study Bible just out of referring to passages in which God provides in various ways for us. God is concerned for justice, a justice worker and a judge. God is a community builder. God is a transformer or restorer. And many other terms could also be applied here. It's worth spending a little bit of time just seeing some of the connections between these general categories to describe God's work and the kind of ranges or types of work that we're involved in. Take God as Creator. Certainly God created out of nothing, and we can't do that. It's one of the differences between us and Him. But He has planted within us a creative capacity which comes to expression in all sorts of different ways. God also continues His creative work even now. It didn't stop at the end of Genesis chapter 1 or 2. Psalm 139, 13 and other psalms, other passages talk about this. Whenever anyone is engaged in work that has something inventive about it, something novel, something creative, as we say, they are reflecting something of a characteristic of God's own wonderful work. We see this obviously in the work of musicians, painters, sculptors, writers, filmmakers, and so on. It's present in all crafts in a variety of ways, making pottery and jewellery, weaving, metalworking, as well in the work of the architect, the interior designer, the urban planner, the web programmer, the landscaper, and in lots of other ways. In lots of everyday ways as well, in activities in the home or outside the home, which I won't go into here. What about God as provider? God's provision for our basic necessities is reflected in many, many human occupations. We see it in the work of service providers, tradespeople, retail suppliers, those who keep organisations tidy, such as cleaners and janitors, those who keep them running, such as managers and administrators. These are further examples. Taxi and bus drivers, mechanics and accountants, repairers and renovators. All these, as well as gardeners, park rangers, conservationists, are involved in some way in helping the world in which we live to be sustained, to continue, and to actually work, to actually function effectively. God's doing that work on a larger scale in His own way every day, otherwise the whole universe would fall to pieces in a millisecond.